There's a silent way to lose power, and most men practice it every day without realizing it. It's not a dramatic mistake, not a major fall, not a public failure. It's something much more subtle. It happens in small moments. When you respond to an unnecessary provocation, when you explain yourself to someone who has already decided not to understand, when you try to prove your worth to someone who never intended to acknowledge it. Each of these moments seems small, almost insignificant, but together they form a constant drain, an invisible leak of authority, energy, and presence. If Niccolò Machiavelli were observing modern life, he would probably identify this wound immediately. He spent years studying human behavior in the corridors of power, watching princes, generals, and advisors rise and fall. And one thing always caught his attention. Men rarely lose influence for lack of strength. They lose it because they surrender power without realizing it. They surrender it when they overreact. They surrender it when they talk too much. They surrender it when they allow any voice, any criticism, any provocation to determine their actions. Most people believe that responding is a sign of strength, that defending oneself demonstrates dignity, that explaining one's intentions proves character. But Machiavelli saw the world in a colder, more precise way. For him, each reaction revealed something to the attentive observer, revealed insecurity, a need for approval, emotional dependence. And all emotional dependence creates a gateway for manipulation. Think about it for a moment. How many times have you responded to someone just to avoid seeming weak? How many times have you felt the need to clarify something so that others wouldn't think the wrong way about you? How many times have you allowed someone's opinion to alter your emotional state, even if that person had no real importance in your life? This is the silent trap, because the moment you try to control what others think, you've already surrendered some control over yourself. Machiavelli understood something that few admit. Human attention is a currency of power, not a symbolic currency, but a real currency within social dynamics. Whoever controls your attention controls your energy, and whoever controls your energy determines their position in the invisible game of human relations. The problem is that almost no one manages this currency responsibly. Most people give away attention as if it were infinite. They respond to every message, react to every criticism, argue with every stranger, and try to convince anyone who disagrees. In the short term, this seems normal. In the long term, it turns someone into something extremely predictable. And predictability was never a valued quality in Machiavelli's thinking. For him, power demands something rarer, the ability not to react when everyone expects a reaction. Imagine a prince in a court rife with intrigue. Insults swirl through the corridors, rumors spread, and criticism arises from every corner. An impulsive ruler would respond immediately. He would try to correct every lie, refute every accusation, and silence every opponent. But in doing so, he would reveal something dangerous. He would show that he can be provoked, that he can be manipulated, that his attention can be captured by any stimulus. A prince like that doesn't govern the environment. He is governed by it. Machiavelli observed many men like that, men who believed they were defending their honor, when in reality, they were revealing their strategic weakness. A truly strong ruler acted differently. He didn't respond to everything. He didn't react to every provocation. Often he remained completely silent, and this silence created something that words never could: uncertainty. When someone talks too much, they become easy to understand. When someone overreacts, they become easy to manipulate. But when someone remains calm, quiet, and selective, something changes in the perception of those around them. An inevitable question arises. Why didn't he answer? This question starts small, almost imperceptible, but it grows. People try to interpret the silence. They try to discover if it knows something they don't. They try to understand if its calmness indicates confidence, strategy, or indifference. And the more they try to interpret it, the more weight its presence gains in their minds. This is how silence transforms into presence. Not a noisy presence, not a theatrical presence, but a presence that reorganizes the surrounding behavior without needing to raise its voice. Machiavelli deeply understood this phenomenon. For him, the wise ruler was one who knew when to act, but also knew when to simply allow the environment to move around him. The fox observes before entering the trap. The lion ignores battles too small for its strength. Between observation and restraint lies a form of intelligence that is rarely taught, and it is precisely this intelligence that most people lack today. We live in a world that rewards quick responses, constant opinions, and immediate reactions. Every provocation demands a response. Every criticism demands a defense. Every conflict demands a stance. But this logic creates an extremely predictable type of behavior. People who are always reacting. And those who are always reacting are rarely in control. This realization can cause discomfort. It can raise an uncomfortable doubt. If constantly reacting weakens someone, then how many times have you unknowingly given away power? How many discussions that seemed important were merely distractions? How many explanations you offered only reinforced the impression that you needed to prove something? These questions are uncomfortable because they reveal something profound. The loss of power rarely happens all at once. It happens in small, daily concessions. Just a word here. There's a justification there, an unnecessary reaction over there. Little by little, the energy that could build something greater is dispersed in petty disputes. Machiavelli wouldn't have called this morality or immorality. He would have called it simply strategic reality. The world doesn't reward those who react the most. The world responds to those who maintain control over themselves. And this control begins with something that seems simple, but that few master: the conscious decision not to give your attention to just any stimulus. But there is an even more intriguing detail in this dynamic, a detail that Machiavelli may have noticed while observing the Italian courts, and which modern psychology is beginning to explain more clearly today. When someone stops responding, when someone deliberately withdraws their attention, something unexpected begins to happen in the other person's mind. The silence, which seems empty at first glance, begins to produce a much more powerful effect than any direct response. Understanding this effect completely changes how you view power in human relationships. There's a curious moment that almost everyone has experienced, even if they haven't realized its importance. You send a simple message to someone, maybe a question, maybe a lighthearted teasing, maybe just an attempt to start a conversation. Minutes pass, no reply. After some time, you look at your phone again. Still nothing. Your mind starts working. Maybe the person is busy, maybe they haven't seen it. Maybe they're thinking about what to reply. Hours go by and the silence remains. Suddenly, what began as a trivial interaction starts to occupy space inside your head. This seemingly banal experience reveals something profound about human nature. Silence has an effect that few people fully understand. It doesn't just end a conversation, it creates a void, and the human mind has an almost instinctive difficulty dealing with emptiness. Niccolò Machiavelli would have recognized this phenomenon immediately. Observing the Italian courts, he saw powerful men react in predictable ways to emotional stimuli. A rumor spread in the hall, a word spoken ambiguously, a gesture ignored during a meeting. Small signs generated waves of interpretation, one man not greeting another, and that was enough to trigger speculation, suspicion, and silent conflict. The curious thing is that many of these tensions didn't stem from direct actions. They arose from absences, a glance that never came, an answer that never arrived, a presence that withdrew at the exact moment. Imagine a common situation. Someone in a work group makes a critical comment about you. The natural impulse is to respond immediately, to defend yourself, explain the context, show that the criticism is unfair. This reaction seems logical. It seems correct. But observe what happens when someone acts differently, when criticism arises and finds no response. First, an awkward silence falls. Those around realize something is hanging in the air. The person who criticized begins to feel a slight unease. They might expect a confrontation, perhaps an explanation, perhaps an argument, but nothing happens. Silence creates an unexpected space, and in that space, an invisible process begins. The mind of the person who spoke starts searching for explanations. Perhaps they exaggerated. Perhaps the other person didn't care. Perhaps that silence signifies something they didn't understand. Doubt arises, and doubt has a curious power. It multiplies. Machiavelli understood that the human mind does not like to remain in doubt for long. When it does not find external answers, it begins to create internal ones. And these answers are often more intense than any real reaction could have been. That is why silence possesses such a peculiar quality. It not only ends a dialogue, it transfers the mental work to the other side. While someone who reacts needs to expend energy, explaining, defending, and arguing, someone who remains silent provokes a psychological shift in the other person. The mind begins to revisit the situation, Words are reinterpreted, tones of voice are remembered, small details are analyzed. Perhaps you've experienced something like this without realizing it. After a tense conversation with someone, you left without saying anything. Hours later, that person was still thinking about the date. Maybe they even imagined several versions of what you could have said. Maybe they reconstructed the dialogue countless times in their own head. This process happens because silence creates a feeling of interruption. It's like a sentence that never ends. The human brain tries to complete what was left open. Machiavelli would likely see this phenomenon as extremely useful for anyone wishing to maintain a strategic position. For him, power lay not only in acting, but in understanding how others react to actions, and also to inactions. In Renaissance courts, rumors and interpretations were constant tools. A ruler who reacted to every comment revealed his concerns. A ruler who responded to every criticism demonstrated that he needed to justify himself. But one who remained silent generated a different kind of effect. His silence was interpreted. Some saw confidence. Others imagined strategy. Still others believed he possessed hidden information. Each observer filled in the void with their own projections. And the more projections that emerged, the more the silent figure seemed to gain weight. The curious thing is that none of this requires active effort. It doesn't require speeches, confrontations, or public displays of authority. It only requires enough self-control not to react at the moment when everyone expects a reaction. This doesn't mean that silence is always easy. In fact, it's often deeply uncomfortable. When someone provokes or criticizes us, there's an immediate impulse to respond. It's almost an automatic reflex. Silence demands interrupting that reflex. But when this interruption occurs, something changes in the balance of the situation. Those who react immediately demonstrate that they have been affected. Those who respond impulsively reveal exactly where they were hurt. But those who remain silent leave a question unanswered. And this issue begins to grow in the other person's mind. Maybe he didn't care. Perhaps I went too far. Perhaps there's something I haven't noticed. Doubt continues to linger. Machiavelli deeply understood the value of this uncertainty. In a political environment full of disputes and unstable alliances, often the most powerful figure was not the loudest, but the most difficult to decipher. He who spoke little forced others to observe more. He who reacted less caused each of his gestures to be interpreted more carefully. This is one of the most interesting ironies of human relationships. The more someone tries to control the perception of others through constant explanations, the more predictable they become. And the more predictable someone becomes, the easier it is to anticipate their reactions. But when someone learns to remove unnecessary responses, the dynamic changes. Silence ceases to be merely absence, begins to function as a space for interpretation. And within this space, each person projects their own expectations, fears, and hypotheses. This doesn't only happen in environments of power or politics. It happens in ordinary conversations, in personal relationships, in everyday interactions. A gesture that goes unanswered, a provocation that finds no echo, a message that remains without reaction, can trigger long sequences of reflection. The human mind simply doesn't like to be ignored. And that is precisely why silence, when used consciously, can completely transform the balance of an interaction. But here, an important question arises. Remaining silent does not mean disappearing completely. There is a fundamental difference between absence and something much more subtle, a difference that Machiavelli would understand immediately. The difference between disappearing and to withdraw strategically. There's a subtle moment when someone realizes they no longer need to fight for every space around them. This moment doesn't happen dramatically, nor is it accompanied by applause or immediate recognition. It arises when a person understands that being present everywhere doesn't mean having influence in any of them. Niccolò Machiavelli observed something similar in the corridors of Italian courts. Men who spoke at every meeting, who responded to every rumor and defended themselves against every criticism seemed active, but in reality, they were wearing themselves out. Meanwhile, others remained quieter, observing, carefully choosing when to appear and when to retreat. Gradually, these silent men became more difficult to interpret, and that which cannot be easily interpreted begins to generate respect. Strategic withdrawal stems from this perception. It's not about disappearing or abandoning the field. It's about something more refined, learning to be present without completely exposing oneself. Imagine someone sitting in a meeting room. Several people discuss ideas, exchange arguments, compete for attention. One person speaks less, observes more, reacts little. Their presence is still there, but their energy isn't dispersed in every detail. When they finally decide to speak, everyone pays attention, not because they shouted louder, but because their words have become rare. Machiavelli understood that rarity creates weight. Frequent words lose force, just as excessively distributed currency loses value. A ruler who reacts to everything becomes predictable. A ruler who reacts little becomes difficult to anticipate. And when one cannot anticipate their movements, a silent form of respect arises. Silence becomes not merely an absence of response, but a form of concentrated presence. But here an inevitable question arises. How many times have you felt the need to respond immediately just to avoid appearing weak? Most people live in a constant state of availability. The phone vibrates, the response comes. A provocation appears, the reaction arises. A criticism is made, the defense is instantaneous. This behavior seems natural because it has been normalized. However, it creates an invisible dynamic. When everyone knows you always respond, everyone knows exactly how to provoke your response. And when your reactions are predictable, your behavior ceases to be a choice and becomes a reflex. Machiavelli would have observed this with an almost clinical coldness. For him, predictability was a vulnerability. A strategist doesn't need to win every dispute. He needs to control when the dispute happens. And controlling the moment also means mastering the timing of one's own presence. Sometimes power lies in acting quickly. Other times it lies in simply not acting. There's a common scene in everyday life that illustrates this logic well. Someone tries to provoke you in public, perhaps with irony, perhaps with indirect criticism. Everyone expects an immediate confrontation. The atmosphere prepares for an exchange of words, but the response doesn't come. Silence fills the space. People start looking at each other, waiting for something to happen. And the curious thing is that at that moment, the person who made the provocation begins to feel the discomfort they imagined they would cause. Why does this happen? Because the provocation was launched expecting a specific type of reaction. When the reaction doesn't appear, the emotional structure of the situation becomes disorganized. The attack loses its immediate target, and the silence returns the tension to whoever initiated the move. Machiavelli would probably say that at that moment, the board changed position without any pieces being moved. This phenomenon reveals something important about human behavior. Many people are not prepared to deal with those who don't react as expected. They know how to handle confrontation. They know how to handle arguments. They know how to defend themselves. What they don't know how to handle is the absence of these things. Silence creates a kind of uncertain ground where no one is sure what is happening. And when the terrain becomes uncertain, people begin to adapt. This is where strategic withdrawal reveals its true strength. It's not just a gesture of self-control, but a silent reorganization of the social environment. Those who master this posture don't need to dominate every conversation, because they master something deeper, the rhythm of interactions. Now another important question arises. How many times have you gotten into discussions that, looking back, changed absolutely nothing? Machiavelli knew that constant attrition weakens any position of power. A leader who argues over every detail ends up being dragged into disputes that are too small for their role. Strategic retreat protects something essential, the energy that could be used for truly important decisions. By not reacting to everything, you preserve the ability to act when it really matters. This process also changes how others perceive you. The person who is always involved in everything becomes part of the noise. On the other hand, the person who is less visible, but chooses their moments carefully, begins to be seen with more attention, not because they tried to stand out, but because their presence has become less commonplace. There's a kind of silent magnetism in this behavior. People start to observe more closely someone who doesn't reveal everything immediately. They begin to try to understand their intentions, their opinions, their strategies, and while they do this, they attribute to that person a greater importance than perhaps that person themselves had sought. Machiavelli deeply understood this type of dynamic. In complex political environments, he knew that often the most effective force was not the most visible, but the most difficult to decipher. A completely transparent ruler could be easily anticipated. A ruler who kept some of his intentions secret created a zone of uncertainty that hindered any attempt at manipulation. But here, another issue arises that is rarely discussed: The real challenge of strategic withdrawal lies not in external behavior, but in internal control. Can you really remain silent when someone tries to provoke a reaction from you? Because mastering silence in the presence of others requires something deeper than just momentary discipline. It demands the ability to observe your own impulses without immediately obeying them. The urge to respond still appears. The desire to explain still arises. The wish to defend your position continues to exist. The difference is that you begin to consciously decide when that impulse deserves to be transformed into action. This decision seems simple, but it completely changes the balance of any interaction. Those who react are always trapped by the movements of others. Those who choose when to react begin to create their own rhythm. And when someone starts to create their own rhythm within human relationships, something interesting happens. The people around them begin to adjust their own movements. It is at this point that strategic withdrawal ceases to be merely an individual action and becomes a silent form of influence. But there is still an aspect of this strategy that few realize. Not all voices even deserve this strategic distance. Some simply don't deserve any attention at all. Understanding this difference completely changes how someone manages their power within relationships. There is a decisive moment in anyone's life when they begin to understand the value of their own attention. It's when they realize they don't need to respond to everything, but also discover something even more important. Some people simply don't deserve any space in their mind. Niccolò Machiavelli perceived this principle by observing 16th century Italian politics, an environment where rumors, intrigues, and indirect attacks were as common as the air one breathed. In the corridors of the palaces of Florence, Venice, and Rome, words were silent weapons. A casual comment could destroy reputations. An ignored glance could start conflicts. In this scenario, responding to every provocation wasn't strength, it was exhaustion. There's a curious story often mentioned by historians when discussing diplomacy of the time. In certain political gatherings, a ruler would receive indirect accusations or public provocations during banquets. Many expected an immediate confrontation. After all, honor and reputation were extremely sensitive values in that context. But in some cases, the leader would simply remain silent, change the subject, or converse with someone else at the table. This created an awkward situation. The provocateur, expecting a reaction, was left exposed before everyone, unsure how to proceed. The silence shifted the weight of the situation. The attack remained in the air, but now seemed misplaced, almost inappropriate. Machiavelli observed these situations with almost scientific attention. For him, every human interaction revealed patterns of behavior. He knew that many people provoke not because they desire a real conflict, but because they expect an emotional reaction. This reaction serves as confirmation of power. If someone manages to provoke a response, they have proven that they can manipulate emotions. But when the answer doesn't come, something curious happens. The provocateur loses control of the situation. Imagine a modern scenario. Someone makes an aggressive comment on social media, hoping to start a public argument. Many people engage in endless debates, trying to prove they are right. Hours pass, arguments arise, new attacks appear. In the end, no one changes their mind, but everyone has wasted energy. Now imagine another possibility. The comment appears and receives no response whatsoever. No reaction, no discussion, no attempt to justify or explain. The comment remains there, isolated. What happens to the person who wrote that? Interestingly, she often returns to her own comment to check if anyone has responded. The expectation of a reaction creates a kind of psychological suspense, and when that reaction doesn't appear, the person begins to wonder if their attack was even relevant. This phenomenon has been observed in recent studies on digital behavior. Researchers have found that provocative comments generate greater frustration when they go unanswered. The author of the comment expects conflict, expects attention, expects someone to engage in the dispute. When this doesn't happen, the emotional impact falls on the person who initiated the provocation. Machiavelli probably wouldn't be surprised by this fact. For him, many social attacks were attempts to capture attention, and capturing attention means capturing energy. Throughout history, there are curious examples of this logic operating on much larger scales. During diplomatic negotiations, certain leaders deliberately ignored provocations made by adversaries. Instead of responding directly, they continued the conversation on another subject, as if the attack had not occurred. Observers of the time describe how this created an unexpected atmosphere in the room. The aggressor had to decide whether to insist on the provocation or back down, and often they backed down, because insisting alone on an attack that no one acknowledges creates embarrassment. This type of situation reveals something profound about human behavior. Many disputes don't survive without recognition. Conflicts need two parties to continue existing. When only one party persists and the other remains indifferent, the dynamic changes completely. In everyday life, this happens more often than we realize. Someone tries to start an argument at work. A person spreads a rumor expecting a reaction. An acquaintance provokes someone in a meeting expecting a debate. In all these cases, there is an implicit expectation, the expectation that someone will respond. And when that response doesn't happen, the structure of the situation falls apart. It's like trying to start a dance when the other person can't keep up with the movement. Machiavelli understood that this silent refusal can be a powerful way to preserve position. For him, a ruler did not need to fight every battle. In fact, fighting every battle was a sure way to waste strategic energy. The wise ruler chooses his conflicts carefully. He recognizes that some disputes are merely distractions. There is a curious detail in the chronicles of Renaissance politics. Certain times, influential figures completely ignored minor adversaries, as if they simply did not exist. There were no insults, no direct attacks, no public confrontations, just a lack of recognition. Historians note that, in many cases, these adversaries gradually disappeared from the political scene. Without direct opposition to fuel their relevance, they lost ground and attention. This phenomenon also occurs in much simpler environments. In social groups, people who constantly try to provoke reactions end up losing influence when no one responds. Provocative behavior depends on attention to survive. This raises an important question. How many of the discussions that seem urgent right now are just disguised cries for attention? Responding to everything means accepting to participate in all the games that come your way. Ignoring some of these games means choosing where to truly invest your energy. Machiavelli understood that power requires selection, the selection of what deserves action and what should simply be left aside. This type of discernment is rarely explicitly taught, but it appears repeatedly in political history. Leaders who learn to ignore certain provocations manage to maintain emotional stability. Leaders who respond to every attack end up trapped in endless cycles of reaction. The curious thing is that this choice doesn't require grand confrontations. Often it manifests itself in something extremely simple, not reacting. This seemingly small decision creates a cumulative effect. Over time, people realize that certain attempts at provocation don't work on you. Gradually, they stop trying. Others begin to observe more carefully before provoking, and some simply redirect their energy elsewhere. But there is an obstacle that makes this process more difficult than it seems: the human impulse to respond. Even when we know a provocation doesn't deserve attention, something inside us still wants to react. The urge to explain, correct, defend, or confront arises almost automatically, and it is precisely at this point that the real difficulty arises. Because ignoring others is relatively simple, it is far more difficult to control the internal impulse that demands a reaction. There's an almost invisible instant when a provocation crosses the air and finds you. Sometimes it comes in the form of criticism, sometimes in a tone of irony, sometimes in seemingly innocent words. But something inside you reacts immediately. The body notices first. The chest tightens slightly, breathing changes. The mind begins to prepare a response. In a few seconds, arguments, justifications, ready-made phrases emerge. It's as if your entire system is preparing for a confrontation. This moment happens so quickly that many people don't even realize it exists. They simply respond, and it is precisely at this point that the majority loses power. Niccolò Machiavelli understood something that few dared to admit. Most human battles don't take place in the external field, but within one's own mind. A man can win arguments, can win debates, can prove he is right before everyone, and still remain a prisoner of his own reactions. Because whenever someone manages to provoke his emotion and determine his response, that person exerts a form of invisible control. Imagine a simple situation. Someone makes a provocative comment during a conversation, perhaps a subtle remark, perhaps a direct attack. The atmosphere becomes tense. Everyone awaits your reaction. The natural impulse is to respond immediately, to show that you don't accept it. This impulse seems legitimate. It even seems necessary. But there's a detail that almost no one notices. The moment you react impulsively, you confirm exactly the effect the provocation sought. Machiavelli would observe this scene like a strategist observes a chessboard. He would not only be interested in what was said, but in the emotional movement that was generated. The instigator expected a reaction. The one who reacts confirms the effectiveness of the attack. The dispute begins exactly where the instigator wanted it to. Now imagine something different. The provocation happens. The atmosphere awaits your response, but you remain silent for a few seconds. It's not a confused silence, nor an awkward one. It's a firm, conscious silence. You observe the situation as if you were watching something from the outside. The tension that was poised to escalate into conflict begins to change shape. What happens at this moment is surprising. The person who provoked it begins to realize that it didn't have the desired effect. The attack has lost its immediate impact. The atmosphere doesn't turn into a confrontation, and that silence creates a strange, almost uncomfortable space. But there is a huge obstacle to overcome before reaching that point: the urge to react. Controlling this impulse requires something Machiavelli deeply valued: self-mastery. Not the theatrical mastery that appears in public speeches, but the silent mastery that takes place within the mind before any word leaves the mouth. This mastery doesn't emerge overnight. It's built through small moments of restraint. Every time someone tries to provoke a reaction from you, an invisible choice is at play. The choice between acting automatically or observing the impulse before acting. Think about how many times you've responded to something simply because you felt you needed to respond at that moment. How many arguments started because two people reacted at the same time, each defending their position. How many conflicts could have ended before they even began if someone had interrupted the cycle of reaction. Machiavelli knew that governing requires precisely this kind of discipline. A ruler who reacts impulsively reveals his emotional makeup to everyone around him. He shows where his sensitivity lies, where his insecurities are, where his limits are. Each reaction reveals a little more of the internal map of his emotions, and a visible emotional map can be explored. Therefore, the strategist learns something different. He learns to observe his own reaction before transforming it into action. This small space between stimulus and response becomes the place where real power appears. It is in this space that the momentum begins to lose strength. But here's where an interesting twist emerges. The more you control your reactions, the more the behavior of your surrounding environment changes. People who previously tried to provoke you begin to hesitate. They realize they can't generate the desired effect. Some raise the tone of the provocation, trying to force a response. Others give up completely, and some begin to observe you more cautiously, because someone who doesn't react easily becomes unpredictable, and unpredictability creates respect. There is something almost instinctive in human behavior when faced with someone who is emotionally stable. When a person realizes they cannot manipulate their emotions through criticism or provocation, they begin to adjust their own attitude. This adjustment happens silently. There are no ads, no direct confrontations, just a gradual shift in how people interact with you. Machiavelli saw this type of transformation in power relations. A leader who maintains emotional control becomes difficult to pressure. His adversaries don't know exactly how to provoke him, nor when he will act. This type of figure creates a zone of uncertainty around himself, and uncertainty alters the behavior of others. But mastering this discipline requires facing a constant challenge. Even after learning to control reactions, there will still be times when the provocation seems too strong to ignore. A word can hit something personal. A comment can touch an old wound. The urge to respond arises again. It is in these moments that true strength emerges, not in the absence of emotion, but in the ability not to be governed by it. Machiavelli would probably say that a strategist doesn't eliminate their emotions. They merely decide when emotions can influence their actions. This detail seems small, but it completely changes the dynamics of human relationships. Because when someone notices that you don't react impulsively, something curious happens. The person needs to rethink their own strategy, and when this happens repeatedly, a bigger change begins to emerge. The dynamics of the interaction cease to be based on automatic reaction and begin to revolve around who controls the emotional rhythm of the situation. This silent control is a form of power that is rarely acknowledged in public. He doesn't appear in speeches, nor in dramatic confrontations. But it is this that separates people who live reacting to the world from people who begin to influence the world around them. And it is precisely at this point that the final transformation begins to take shape. A transformation that Machiavelli would understand immediately. The transition from someone who reacts to their environment to someone who becomes difficult to reach. There is a quiet moment when a person realizes they have spent too much time reacting to the world. It's not a dramatic instant. There's no public announcement, no applause. It's just an internal perception, almost discreet. A simple but powerful understanding. For too long, you have allowed other people to determine where your attention would go, how much of your energy would be spent, and which emotions would dominate your days. Niccolò Machiavelli is said to have seen this realization as the beginning of a strategic transformation. For him, true power never begins with controlling others. It begins with self-control. A man who does not govern his own reactions will hardly govern any situation around him. Throughout this reflection, you've seen something that many people go years without realizing. Small reactions may seem insignificant, but added up over time they build a pattern, responding to every provocation, explaining every decision, justifying every step in the face of any opinion, turns someone into a prisoner of others' expectations. The person begins to live as if they are always responding to an invisible call, trying to correct perceptions, prove their worth, defend their positions. But the change begins when you understand that your attention is a limited resource. Every minute spent arguing about something irrelevant is a minute that could have been used to build something bigger. Every impulsive reaction gives the other person control of that moment. Every unnecessary explanation reinforces the idea that you need someone's approval. Machiavelli would see this extremely clearly. For him, a ruler who depends on constant approval never truly governs. He merely reacts to his environment. The first step to changing this dynamic is simple, but it requires awareness. Start observing your reactions. Not just what you say, but the exact moment you feel the urge to respond. When criticism arises, when someone provokes you, when the immediate desire to explain something appears, stop for a moment. Observe the impulse before acting. This small space for observation changes everything, because at that moment you regain something that many people have lost without realizing it: choice. Instead of reacting automatically, you begin to decide if that situation truly deserves your attention. Some deserve it, others don't. This distinction may seem small, but it completely transforms the way you live. Gradually, you begin to realize that many arguments never needed to exist. Many conflicts were just noise. Many provocations only had power because you responded to them. When you stop reacting to everything, something interesting happens. Your time expands. Your energy is preserved. Your mind begins to clear. The space that was previously occupied by reactions becomes occupied by focus. And focus builds greater things. Machiavelli understood that strategy requires precisely that: concentration of energy. A leader who is distracted by petty disputes will never have enough strength to act in truly decisive moments. On the other hand, someone who carefully chooses where to invest their attention creates a different kind of presence, a more stable presence, more difficult to provoke, more difficult to manipulate. This process doesn't turn you into someone cold or distant. On the contrary, it allows your energy to be directed towards what truly matters: your projects, your growth, your genuine relationships, your purpose. When you stop wasting energy on unnecessary conflicts, you free up space to build something more meaningful. And that is perhaps the greatest lesson hidden in all of this. Ignoring certain things isn't weakness. Often it's the clearest way to demonstrate maturity and strategy. It means you recognize the value of your time and don't allow any stimulus to control it. Over time, the people around you begin to notice this change. Some will try to provoke you again, hoping for the old reaction. Others will be surprised by your calmness. And some will simply stop trying, because they will realize that they can no longer manipulate your emotions so easily. This is the beginning of a new stance towards the world. Not a stance of constant confrontation, but a stance of inner mastery. Machiavelli would probably say that this is the moment when someone stops being led by their environment and begins to steer their own path, not because they control everything around them, but because they control what truly matters: their choices, their responses, and their attention. And from here, the path is clear. Observe more than react. Choose your battles carefully. Protect your attention as a precious resource. Direct your energy toward what builds your future. These simple decisions, repeated over time, create a profound transformation. It doesn't happen all at once, but little by little you realize that your mind becomes calmer, your decisions become clearer, and your presence becomes more firm. This change begins with something very small, the decision not to react automatically. If this reflection has brought you any benefit, turn that idea into action starting today. Observe a situation in which you would normally react and try doing something different. Just observe, breathe, and consciously choose your response. Small choices build big changes. If this content resonated with you, please show your support here on the channel. Like this video so that more people can find this message. If you'd like, you can also leave a comment sharing your thoughts or experience. You can even do it anonymously if you prefer. Often, a simple sentence is enough to show that this conversation reached someone on the other side of the screen. And if you want to continue exploring ideas about strategy, human behavior, and personal growth, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. That way you won't miss the upcoming content we'll be sharing. The reflection is over now, but the practice begins elsewhere. Observe the world with more calm. Choose your answers more carefully, and use your attention to build the life you truly want.